without any further ado, I want to introduce the first of our two speakers for today. We are very lucky to have with us Stefaan Verhulst, who is my colleague here at the GovLab, co-founder of the GovLab. He's also our Chief of Research. And importantly, he leads a great deal of the work that we do on responsible data sharing frameworks. And I will spare it, in order to have more time to hear from him, I'm going to let him tell you what he does and dive right in. And the hope is that Stefaan knows this is supposed to be a discussion, and we will have lots of conversation, we hope, about how these general principles of responsible data sharing that are lessons that Stefaan can share from working in domains ranging from national security to health to education, as well as criminal justice, how we can bring those to bear on the work that you're doing. So Stefaan, thank you for joining us, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Beth, for the short introduction here, and for the previous speakers to give me a sense of the great projects that you are working on. And it's also delighted to have Shumendra on the call, and be delighted to have him part of this discussion as well. Well, what I was planning on doing today was to really focus on what we start to call data responsibility. I mean, in the past, of course, much of the discussion about data sharing has been about privacy, has been about security. But what we believe at GovLab, having worked also with a variety of other stakeholders, is that we really, at a time of big data, we really have to start moving towards what we call data responsibility, which includes, of course, privacy considerations, but also includes being aware of other risks that might occur as a result of actually sharing and using certain kinds of data. Now, obviously, the whole objective for having a data responsibility approach is to ultimately achieve a more data-driven decision-making process. And it seems like the whole effort here is all about making criminal justice more data-driven, so that it ultimately provides for more targeted and more evidence-based kind of interventions that ultimately will be more impactful. And so much of the value around data is around providing more accurate assessments. We already have seen this in the two earlier examples, that is really trying to understand the problem better, so they also can address it and measure progress. It's also about tracking deployment, allocation, resources, impact measurement we've already seen, and ultimately where data science is moving towards is about not only being able to monitor progress, but also to predict eventually trends and possibly threats. Now, these values obviously are embedded in the use of data, but I think what we also have to start becoming far more sophisticated about are the risks that exist when using data or when starting to share data. And I think important first message that I want to make at this call here is that there are risks obviously involved with sharing and using data, and that those risks are not unique to one stage of the data lifecycle, but that the risks are basically spread across the data lifecycle, and that one has to really start approaching the risks from a data lifecycle approach, and meaning that there are risks at the collection stage, how the data is being collected, whether it was collected exactly with the adequate permissions, whether it was accurate, how it was shared, how it was subsequently analyzed and processed, where it was stored, and then ultimately how it was used, and whether it was used in a manner that was appropriate towards the mandate of those who actually collected, shared, or analyzed it. And so across the data lifecycle, there are risks involved, and it is important for anyone who works with data to become sophisticated about the risks involved, and then subsequently also to develop a set of mitigation strategies that can deal with those risks. Important to mention here as well is that even if sharing is the ultimate objective, perhaps, of the efforts, you still have to be aware of the risks that are associated with, for instance, collection stage, because you could share dirty data that ultimately might have implication with regard to your dashboard, the decisions that you want to make, and so on. So the risks are across the data lifecycle, and if ignored, they augment across the data lifecycle as well. And so one needs to be aware of the various stages. Now, some examples, of course, in the criminal justice environment of risks involved. And so one example is, for instance, the Secure Communities effort that now has been replaced by the Priority Enforcement Program, that ultimately tried to identify and deport immigrants that might be illegal in the country or have a criminal conviction. And so it turned out that because the data was not always accurate, that several false positives ultimately were present. And so there was a clear risk here with regard to the data. Was the data collected, and was it in a manner that provided for accuracy? And then ultimately there was a harm as a result of the risk that might have been mitigated or might have been mitigated more, which ultimately led to, of course, harmful deportation that could have been prevented. Other kind of risk was with regard to the modeling that Noordpointe did with regard to trying to predict violent crime and criminal behavior. And based upon an assessment that, for instance, ProPublica and others have done, they also identified that here the risk was with regard to biased algorithms. And so, which is also a risk that then ultimately can have a harmful impact with regard to, for instance, profiling certain kinds of individuals as more inclined to express violent behavior, that ultimately then again might have a variety of civil liberties concerns to how they go to the one that we discussed with regard to collecting. Now, there are also risks involved, of course, with how you store the data, and everyone, of course, is aware of cybersecurity risks. And so here, an example of the organization called Crackass that ultimately hacked several kinds of law enforcement databases, including also the email of CIA Director John Brennan, which indicates that clearly there are also risks involved with regard to how the information is stored. And again, that's one element. How do you go about the risks and what to do about it? And recently we've been writing about a data responsibility approach, and we did that mainly in the context not of sharing criminal justice data, or in the context of what I worked on in the past, healthcare and national security, but here was mainly in the context of humanitarian aid, and so, but is also applicable to the criminal justice field. And so here are two recent publications that I contributed to that might be of interest, and I can share, or we will share, I guess, through the chat, the link to those documents if of interest. Now, the key element in those documents, or in the recent thinking that we propose, is that in order to develop a responsible data approach, which ultimately aims to maximize the value of sharing and using data, you really have to start adopting a process that has four components. So what we argue is that this is not having a data privacy policy, or just having a data privacy policy. This is not just having a policy document that says, yes, we have a responsible data policy. This is really about embedding a process in the organization that will deal with the ultimate objective of generating value while limiting risk. And the four-step process that we propose is a very straightforward one, in which you first have an assessment of the context, Secondly, a really good understanding of the data, and then also the challenges that are associated with the data, so the risks and the harms, and then ultimately trying to understand, knowing what you try to do within what context, what data, how do you then start mitigating the risks, which could go beyond what HIPAA might require, for instance, or it could be an element to actually think beyond the existing legal means that are traditionally being provided. So what I want to do now is briefly touch on each stage, and then reflect on some of the, of course, data handling policies or practices that are common for the last 30 years, but that still need refinement, and that ultimately in a big data environment needs to be repositioned, because obviously they were developed for a previous era and now turns out to, of course, have challenges. But the first step in a data responsibility framework or a process is really about the assessment of the benefit and the context in which you want to use the data. And so much of what we do at GovLab always starts from the problem. And I always say that if it's hard to define the problem, or it's hard to describe the benefit of using the data, then you probably should not have access to the data or use the data, because it might, of course, lead to all kinds of risks, because you might actually use data that is not helping you solve the problem. And so the first step for every data project should be about really trying to understand what the problem is that you seek to solve with the data, and ultimately what the values that you might want to achieve, because that will allow you to also then basically contextualize the risk, because it might be, of course, that you really, the value of using the data really allows you to then accept the risk and try to mitigate the risk that is embedded in the data. Important to understand also is that you might assess who has the data at the moment, or who should have our access to the data, because that ultimately also will imply certain kinds of risk assessments. For instance, it might be good to understand those who have the data, what is their reputation with regard to data responsibility, what is their reputation with regard to security, for instance. And so those assessments might be useful and important for you to ultimately also then start judging the risk that might be involved in it. Important also is to, for instance, start thinking and having an assessment about the urgency of having access to the data, because in some contexts, like in disaster and conflict contexts, sometimes it is, anyway, urgency is might prevail. And then the question is, of course, how do you do this in a manner that doesn't suddenly put aside all the data responsibility approaches that you were intended to follow. And again, equally of importance is metrics of success, because quite too often in this field, there is a lot of discussion about data and data risks, but too little evidence whether actually having used the data made a difference. Because if that is the case, that there is, for instance, no evidence that it shows that it made a difference, then why be liable for the risks that you are undertaken for accessing and using the data? So important is also to actually have metrics of success with regard to your data project, because that ultimately, from my point of view, is an element of data responsibility as well. And again, goes beyond the traditional narrow debate about data privacy and security. And those elements, again, don't have to be complicated or embedded in a long process. It's just part of a process that at least will put you in a position to be more sophisticated and also more prepared about how to go about it. The second element of the process that we are developing and have used is basically the data audit and inventory, which is really about trying to understand what data is needed to answer the question. And quite often this is, again, a step that is skipped quite often, because too often we see projects where the rationale is give me access to all the data and then I will figure out how to use the data. I mean, data audit, i.e. what data point do I really need in order to be able to answer the question that I'm trying to answer in order to solve the problem. The data audit is actually already an element to mitigate the risk, because that will allow you automatically to be more smarter about, do I actually have to have access, or do I actually have to be in a position of risk to access all the data sets, knowing that I actually only need one data point. And so a data audit is equally important with regard to the data responsibility framework, and then ultimately also a set of other questions, including, of course, does the data contain PII or personally identifiable information? And of course, knowing that most valuable information is quite often PII, as we already have seen in the introduction here of the projects. But clearly, we need to then also understand that handling PII has a much higher risk profile than handling non-PII, which might also have a risk profile beyond privacy. The third step then ultimately is about risks, scenarios really, and harms. Too often you have a sense of the data, you have a sense of the context and the value you want to generate, and the risk proposition as well. But it might be good to actually then also think this through and say, well, what are risk scenarios that we should anticipate, and how are we going to get prepared to deal with that scenario, knowing that there is no such thing as a 100% risk-free environment, especially as we are dealing with the kind of information that has been discussed. And so the third stage is really, and again, this doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be complicated, but at least have a moment of reflection about and understanding about what are the scenarios with regard to the risks, such as, for instance, data being correlated with other data sources that ultimately then could be toxic, given the fact that they might be profiling people, but that could also be ultimately what you want. But then that's, of course, what is the risk of having this being used in a manner that was not intended. Raw data being publicly released is of course always a scenario, a disaster scenario, data system being maliciously breached, data being misinterpreted, that ultimately might undermine the reputation of the program and ultimately lead, as we have seen in many cases, lead to ultimately halting the program, which was intended to create benefit and improvement of people's lives quite often, but ultimately the way it was set up was then led to the opposite. All right, so once we have gone through the process, we are in a much better position than to understand, well, what do we go about this? And of course, this could be, for instance, saying that, well, we have, of course, in addition to our process, we also have to be aware of HIPAA, but I think one needs to go beyond the legal framework, knowing that obviously that is step number one, is not to do anything illegal, but you also have to think in terms of other countermeasures. And that could include, for instance, and again, what we try to do here is to say it has to go beyond just legal approaches, but quite often a decision tree is very helpful that allows you to decide and reflect on different questions, as we already have posed, before you start sharing and using the data. Data handling policies obviously could be countermeasures, technical means such as access controls to the data, so that you actually have some concept of authorized use, and that only those who are authorized actually have access to the data under certain kinds of conditions. The identification techniques, which we, of course, you all are aware of. We're also aware of the limitations, but that doesn't mean that they have no value. And then ultimately, this is about cultural change and making the environment and the organization a data responsible environment. And that requires quite often training staff to actually use the decision tree or to be aware of the risks involved. Now, one element that I want to emphasize, because most of you probably know it, but it is still important, as quite often as the the guidelines to start with as you develop data handling policies is obviously the fair information practice principles that are embedded in HIPAA somewhat and are embedded in other legal approaches, but really are still, despite, of course, their limitations in the big data environment, are still basically the golden guidelines in order to determine how to handle data. And basically, it's a set of principles that I always say should be translated in a set of questions. And so it first starts with openness and transparency, which is all about, is the policy or the way you're going to handle, is that made transparent? Then ultimately it's about purpose specification, which again, quite often is now harder to do given the fact that much of what we're talking about is about secondary use of data. But still, it's important to understand what was the purpose for gathering the data, because that ultimately will also give you a sense of whether that actually the data is valuable for you to use, or what are the data scientific challenges to actually use it for other purposes. But are the purposes defined and understood? Then collection limitation, which is of course all about trying to limit the collection, which then will reduce the risk as well. But again, that might be limited in the current environment, but at least it's still an element to be considered. Use limitation, of course, they say, well, we will only use the data for what was agreed upon, or what the initial purpose was, which was, of course, now being challenged, but it's still an element to be considered. And then ultimately the individual participation and control. So those that you want to benefit, or the data that you're using from of the individuals, do they know, and has there been some kind of a communication? And that could be consent, but what I try to emphasize here is that the consent is not the only, as you can see, the only element you should consider. Mainly this is about a package of provisions and measures, and consent is one of them. Unfortunately, in various contexts, it's been overemphasized as being the only and most important one. I would argue that actually the other ones are equally important, such as including, for instance, data integrity and quality, because that's again linked to the collection and dirty data kind of challenges, and security safeguards and controls. Of course, I mean, to what extent is your system secure? To what extent do those have access to the system? Is there a way to audit, for instance, the access? So security safeguards and controls. And then ultimately, this is about accountability and oversight. So who ultimately is seeing and should oversee the use of the data that is being proposed. And so that could be a data officer, or it could be any other kinds of position or process, again, to assure a set of accountability. Embedding those 8 principles really allows you, again, to make sure that you have gone the extra mile with regard to thinking through how you would provide responsibility. Now, given the fact that we are talking quite often about big data and also the use of certain data for certain purposes, there is also a data ethical component, which has been proposed by several others these days, and this really relates to then profiling and discriminatory implications of the use of data. Also quite often relate to the so-called data invisible, i.e. you actually are making decisions, but certain groups in society might not be in your universe, and hence are not taken into consideration when making decisions. And so you have to be also aware of whether there are invisible groups that are not in your data set, but will be affected by the decisions that you make based upon the data set. And then also public expectations and sensitivities. And we've seen in several contexts the creation of ethical councils, which might be useful as well in order to get a certain level of trust and legitimacy, especially if it deals with, again, those profiling and potentially discriminatory implications of using the data. Now, last big message here is that ultimately this is a collective responsibility, which basically means that the way you develop your countermeasures and the way you develop your responsible approach is important to be inclusive and seen as legitimate, which might mean that at the different stages of the data governance here, as I describe it, you might actually engage with a variety of groups, multi-stakeholder. I've heard already approaches at the different approaches, but you could also think in terms of even co-creation of solutions, or at least having a sense that those that will be affected were consulted in the development of the approaches that you have. And the second element of the collective responsibility framework here is really that given the fact that there are other actors involved in every project that I've heard here, you can be very responsible, but if the other actors act irresponsible, then ultimately the trust chain has been might be flawed. And so this is not about only you acting responsible, but also ensuring that the ecosystem in which you work and the other actors are equally responsible as it relates to the data that they have or share. So with that, open for any questions, but I think the key message what I wanted to share today was that this is really not about just a policy, but it's really about a process that will allow you to improve your program, but also do that in a manner that is responsible, and that those steps that I've outlined today might actually enable you to do this and ultimately generate the benefit that you hope to have.
Stefaan, thank you. We have already a question that's coming on the chat. I just want to remind you that some people are on the phone, most people are on computers, but if you're going to take a question off the chat, if you could repeat the question, and people can also just feel free, Alyssa, maybe you want to actually state your question and people can just jump in and chime in. We'll moderate it if we need to, but I think let's go ahead and we'll try to, if you can also raise your hand electronically, and we'll go from there.
Hi, so this is Tara from San Francisco, and this dialogue, thank you so much for the presentation, brought to mind a number of public information requests that we've received recently. We've done a great job about creating data and becoming data detectives, so finding out the flaws with the data, but we've also created something that can be made available at a push of a button, which is kind of a trigger, a litmus for whether or not something qualifies to be disclosed through a public information request. So one tension we have is knowing something that might be available by push of a button, but also knowing all the flaws that come with it. So balancing kind of our commitment to transparency, our kind of public information, the laws that govern how we share even aggregate information, but how to balance that with what we know is wrong with the data.
Right. I don't know whether that's a question or a statement, because it's clearly a challenge. Mm-hmm. And I think part of dealing with it is exactly knowing that there is no 100% risk-free environment for sharing any kind of information, is to perhaps have have already a disclaimer that can indicate what are the challenges or possible challenges that might be embedded with the data that you are sharing, and then ultimately also have a process in place that can deal with disputes and complaints. Quite often, which is then the feedback loop that you might have, knowing, of course, that you do want to take the extra mile, or you're going to the extra mile to, of course, have the data being shared in a manner that is fully protected according to the statutes that you need to embed. But again, feedback mechanisms are quite often ignored, so that you actually have a mechanism for complaint or red flag issues, and then ultimately being transparent about the challenges or the risks embedded in certain kind of data, especially if you're if you share it with other organizations who will use it for other purposes. I don't know whether that gives you an answer.
Okay, I have a question. This is Angela from Dakota County in Minnesota. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the data invisibles term. I've never heard that term before, and I'm wondering if you could give a couple of examples.
Right. Well, so so the term, let me think. The term really tries to go about the potential bias you might have by using a universe, or a sample, to do, for instance, performance or do prediction that is incomplete with regard to certain kinds of groups in society. So that means that, for instance, you could say, well, look, we're going to use this data set. For instance, just to give you an example, which might not be, and again, when it is administrative data, then quite often you have less of that problem. But for instance, if you would use call detail records to make an assessment of, for instance, mobility of individuals in a city, then you could, and then based upon that, you would then adjust the bus routes, for instance, right? I mean, this is obviously perhaps no criminal justice example, but to give you an example to get a sense what I mean, then you could have the complication that actually those who might use the bus most might not have a phone. And as a result, you would use phone data to actually make decisions that impacts them, and they were not part of the sample that informs you about mobility. And so the data invisibles in this case might have been those who don't have access to phones, and they might be implicated in the decision because they might also be the ones that are using bus most. And so the data invisibles ultimately here have skewed your universe, and there is a bias with regard to the sample. Same thing for banking details. As you know, there's still a large group in society that don't have banking access to bank or financial. And if you start using, for instance, banking records as a sample, then those who don't have access to banks automatically are not part of your assessment. And so that's what I mean by this sample that your data set, or the universe that your data set really knows about. What are the ones that are not included in your sample but will be implicated by decisions that are made based upon the universe that and the data sample that you are using? And so that's what I mean by data invisibles. Is that you?
Yes, it is. Thank you. It's sort of the unintended consequence of who's being left out when you aren't working with that full set, unless it's very transparent. What that sample data set entails.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
And again, it could be, for instance, if you use with data, for instance, that is self-reported, then that might also be a challenge because not everyone is reporting, and then it might be a specific group that you are actually making decisions for, and they might not have been part of the self-reported universe, for instance.
Alabama, you want to chime in?
Yes, this is the Montgomery, Alabama team, and we were wondering, have you ever taken a team of stakeholders through this process? And if you have, how long does it take to get consensus on the data collection, analysis, and the use?
Right, good question. Well, in my previous life, I was based at the Mark Foundation, as Shamendra knows, and so one of the projects there was about developing sharing agreements for medical records. And we created something called Connecting for Health, which was exactly this multi-stakeholder approach in order to develop what we call a common framework for health exchange. Now, it was a lengthy process, but at the same time, several products came out of it, which was at least a consensus about what were the data agreement policies that you've had beyond HIPAA, for instance. What was also came out of it was, for instance, the blue button, which enables, like what was mentioned on the, by clicking a button, you basically have access to certain kinds of data, and what are the policies around that. It was a lengthy process because it started from scratch, and the additional complexity was that it was a national project, so there were 150 different stakeholders. Now, I can assume that if it's a smaller set of stakeholders, you will likely be quicker. But ultimately, I think it was very worthwhile, because without having the buy-in and without having ultimately the process, you might not have had the liquidity of the data that you wanted to have. Now, I would be the last one to say that we need to do more, but at least it was a necessary element.
Do we have any other questions?
But coming back to the last question, by the way, the curation of who is involved does matter. And so doing your constituency mapping and then curating who you want to have at the table does impact the process. And it is either being seen as flawed or it is being seen as inclusive. But curation is an important element of this process. And then you can ultimately decide, again, at each stage, whether there's a different group that is needed. It doesn't always have to be the same group at different stages. You could say we need to have a fully inclusive group in order to define the problem that we want to solve. And then we go smaller as we are developing solutions. And so but it is important to at least think this through in order to ensure that it is seen as inclusive. But then you could get a mandate by an inclusive group and saying, okay, now we're going to go into working groups, which are smaller and more agile to a large extent.
Again, for those people on the phone, we don't know if you're raising your hand, so you should just chime in. We don't have anyone in the queue waiting. So I want to see if anybody who's not on the computer but on a phone wants to ask a question or react.
This is Shamendra. Thank you, Beth, for the opportunity. Stefaan, I appreciate your comments. And yes, it's good to hear the reference back to the Markle Foundation and a lot of the real seminal work you did in, there and with many others as the basis for a lot of what we're doing here with the information sharing environment. I had a question and a comment. Kind of intertwined. What you just were describing about the more inclusive, governance structure than, necking it down to specific subsets of folks working on problems. I tend to think about that as communities of interest, right? That potentially have lots of different specific sharing problems, but really need to define their security and privacy constraints and other constraints that sort of give identity to that community of interest, and then specific teams have a specific information sharing requirement, right, to be able to share data about an incident or a request for information or what have you. Does that dichotomy make sense to you?
Yeah, and clearly community of interest, community of concern are ways forward. And I think we can also be more innovative these days around actually how you develop those communities. So it doesn't always have to be physical community. I mean, quite often, most of the time goes into actually organize the meetings quite often. But you can actually do a lot of work already in more exactly collaborative fashion by using actually some of the tools that we have today in regard to how to do drafting, for instance, or how do you go about some ideation with regard to the solution, or how do you go about getting some legal analysis and comparison, for instance. All this can be done within communities of interest or within specific kind of working groups and task forces that are specifically trying to address one key question.
Thank you.
Great. So last call for comments or questions. If I don't have anybody? Okay, then I'm going to say thank you very much to Stefaan for the fabulous and thorough presentation. I assume it's okay. I've told everybody that we'd be happy to share the slides if that's okay with you. We'll send those out via the listserv. We've already had questions from people who would like to see the slides. And as Stefaan is, of course, part of the GovLab team, if people have questions, follow-up questions about how anything that he's discussed applies to the specifics of your own projects, am I correct that you're happy to help, Stefaan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, this, of course, is a generic framework that needs to be made concrete in order to have more value. But hopefully it allows you to think this through as a process rather than just we need a policy and then we're fine.
Right. Fabulous.